Sarah Mitchell never imagined that a single tattoo would transform her from the most ridiculed person in her workplace to someone who commanded instant respect from one of the military's most elite warriors. For 3 years, she endured daily humiliation, cruel jokes, and professional sabotage from her colleagues who saw her as nothing more than an easy target. They laughed at her quiet demeanor, mocked her dedication, and dismissed her contributions as worthless. But what they didn't know was that beneath her modest exterior lay the mark of a warrior, a spine tattoo that told a story of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood that few civilians would ever understand. When Navy SEAL team leader Marcus Rodriguez spotted that ink during a company event, everything changed in an instant. The same people who had spent years tearing her down were about to discover that they had been tormenting someone whose story would leave them speechless. This is the true story of how respect is earned, how assumptions can destroy lives, and how one moment of recognition can flip an entire world upside down. It's about the hidden strength that lives within ordinary people and the extraordinary circumstances that finally bring it to light. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her cardigan for the 3rd time that morning, pulling it higher around her shoulders as she walked through the glass doors of Henderson Marketing Solutions. The familiar knot in her stomach tightened with each step across the polished marble lobby. 3 years of working here, and she still felt like an intruder in her own workplace. The elevator ride to the 7th floor was mercifully empty, giving her a few precious moments of peace before facing another day of subtle cruelty disguised as office banter. As the doors opened with a soft ding, she could already hear the voices of her colleagues drifting from the break room. "Did you see Sarah's presentation yesterday?" came the voice of Jessica Walsh, the company's self-appointed queen bee. "I swear she was shaking so bad I thought she might pass out right there on stage." Laughter erupted from the group, sharp and cutting. Sarah felt her face flush as she tried to slip past unnoticed, but Jessica's voice carried clearly through the open doorway. "I honestly don't know how she keeps her job. My intern could put together a better marketing strategy," Jessica continued, stirring her coffee with deliberate slowness. "Maybe Mr. Henderson keeps her around for comic relief." More laughter followed, and Sarah quickened her pace toward her cubicle, which sat in the far corner of the office like a forgotten afterthought. Her workspace was deliberately isolated from the main cluster of desks where the popular employees gathered each morning to plan their social activities and gossip about their weekend adventures. As she settled in her chair and powered up her computer, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the black screen. At 28, she looked younger than her years, with shoulder-length brown hair that she kept pulled back in a simple ponytail and brown eyes that seemed too large for her face. She had never been the type to draw attention, preferring to blend into the background wherever possible. But blending in hadn't protected her from becoming the office target. If anything, her quiet nature seemed to invite the cruelty of those who mistook kindness for weakness. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm of isolation. While others chatted excitedly about lunch plans and after-work drinks, Sarah worked steadily on her client accounts, double-checking every detail and staying late to ensure her presentations were flawless. Despite Jessica's cruel comments, Sarah's work was actually exceptional. Her campaigns consistently outperformed those of her louder, more confident colleagues, but somehow her successes were either overlooked or attributed to luck. Around 10:30, James Morrison from the accounting department stopped by her desk. At first, Sarah felt a flutter of hope that someone might actually want to have a normal conversation with her, but his smirk quickly crushed that optimism. "Hey, Sarah," he said, leaning against her desk with false friendliness. "We're organizing a company softball team for the league this summer. You should totally join us." Sarah looked up from her computer, uncertain whether this was a genuine invitation or another setup for humiliation. "Oh, I've never really played softball before." "That's perfect," James exclaimed a little too loudly, drawing attention from nearby cubicles. "We need someone to be the equipment manager. You know, carry the bats, keep score, maybe bring snacks for everyone. It's a really important job." The snickers from the surrounding desks told Sarah everything she needed to know. She wasn't being invited to play. She was being offered the role of unpaid servant to the same people who made her life miserable every day. "I'll think about it," she replied quietly, turning back to her computer screen. "Come on, don't be such a buzzkill," James pressed, his voice taking on an edge. "It's called team building. Maybe if you participated more, you'd actually fit in around here." The implication hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah's fingers tightened around her mouse, but she forced herself to remain calm. I appreciate the offer, but I have a lot of client work to catch up on. James straightened up with an exaggerated sigh. Suit yourself. Just don't complain later that no one includes you in anything. As he walked away, Sarah heard him telling others about her response, painting her as antisocial and ungrateful. The narrative would spread through the office by lunch, becoming another piece of evidence that she was somehow defective, incapable of normal human interaction. The truth was far more complicated. Sarah had learned early in her tenure at Henderson Marketing that every invitation came with invisible strings attached. Every gesture of inclusion was really a setup for public embarrassment. She had made the mistake of trusting her colleagues in the beginning, only to find herself the punchline of jokes she didn't understand until it was too late. During her lunch break, Sarah usually ate alone in her car, finding solace in the quiet privacy where she could drop her guard for 30 minutes. Today was no different. She sat in her old Honda Civic, eating a sandwich she had made at home, and watching other employees laugh together in the courtyard visible through the parking garage. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger brother Tommy, who was stationed overseas with his Army unit. "How's the corporate world treating you, sis? Still kicking butt and taking names?" Sarah smiled despite herself, typing back. "You know me, just trying to stay invisible." "That's not the Sarah I know," came his immediate response. "Remember who you are. Remember what you've overcome. Don't let anyone make you smaller than you are." Tommy's words hit deeper than he probably intended. He was one of the few people who knew the full truth about Sarah's past, about the experiences that had shaped her into someone far stronger than her quiet exterior suggested. But those experiences felt like they belonged to a different person, someone who had existed in a different world entirely. The afternoon brought a department meeting where Sarah was required to present her quarterly results. As she stood at the front of the conference room, she could feel the familiar anxiety creeping up her spine. Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked through her PowerPoint slides, each one showing impressive growth numbers and client satisfaction scores. "As you can see," she said, her voice steady despite her nervousness, "the Reynolds account has increased their advertising spend by 35% this quarter, and customer engagement is up across all platforms." She expected at least some acknowledgement of the significant achievement, but the room remained silent except for the sound of people checking their phones and shuffling papers. "That's great, Sarah," said Mr. Henderson from the back of the room, his tone suggesting mild interest at best. "Jessica, can you walk us through your numbers next?" Jessica stood up with a confident smile, launching into a presentation about an account that had actually lost money but somehow made it sound like a strategic victory. The room came alive with questions and praise, as if they had all suddenly remembered how to pay attention. Sarah gathered her materials and slipped back to her seat, feeling the familiar sting of being overlooked. It didn't matter that her results were consistently the strongest in the department. She lacked the charisma and political savvy that seemed to count for everything in this environment. As the meeting concluded, Sarah overheard Jessica talking to their supervisor about the upcoming company retreat. "I really think we need team-building activities that will bring everyone together. Maybe some trust exercises, group challenges, that sort of thing. Though I suppose some people are just natural followers, you know?" The comment was clearly directed at Sarah, another subtle dig disguised as general conversation. Sarah had heard it all before. She was too quiet, too serious, too rigid. She didn't understand office politics or social dynamics. She was technically competent, but lacked leadership potential. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that Sarah had once led a team through circumstances that would have broken most of the people currently dismissing her as weak. She had made split-second decisions under pressure that saved lives, had earned the respect of people whose opinion actually mattered in the real world. But that world felt impossibly distant from the fluorescent-lit conference room where her colleagues now filed out, chattering about weekend plans and office gossip. Here, she was just a strange, quiet woman who worked too hard and never quite fit in, no matter how excellent her results might be. Back at her desk, Sarah pulled up her computer screen and tried to focus on the work that had always been her refuge. Numbers and strategies made sense in a way that office politics never would. Client relationships could be built on competence and reliability rather than charm and manipulation. Her phone buzzed again with another message from Tommy. "Seriously though, you doing okay? You sound off lately." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, considering how to respond. How could she explain that she felt like she was living two completely different lives? That the person who had once been fearless and decisive now spent her days trying to become invisible? "I'm fine," she typed back. "Just work stuff. You know how it is." "No, I really don't," came his response. "The Sarah I know doesn't let anyone push her around." What happened to the woman who used to say that respect isn't given, it's earned? The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they reminded her of who she used to be. There had been a time when Sarah Mitchell was known for her courage, her unwavering determination, and her ability to command respect in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. But that felt like a lifetime ago, before she had traded one uniform for another, before she had tried to fit into a world that seemed determined to diminish everything she had once been proud of. As the workday wound down and her colleagues began their usual exodus to happy hour venues where Sarah was pointedly not invited, she remained at her desk, finishing up client reports and preparing for the next day's challenges. The office grew quiet except for the hum of computers and the distant sound of the cleaning crew making their rounds. It was nearly 8 o'clock when she finally gathered her things and headed toward the elevator. The building felt different after hours, more peaceful somehow, as if the absence of her tormentors allowed her to breathe more freely. In the parking garage, she encountered Marcus Rodriguez, the security consultant who had been hired to review the building's safety protocols. He was a tall, imposing man with graying hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with military precision. Sarah had seen him around the building over the past few weeks, but had never spoken to him directly. "Working late again?" he asked as they waited for the elevator together. Sarah nodded, unsure how to respond. Small talk had become foreign to her after years of having every casual comment twisted into ammunition for future mockery. "That's dedication," Marcus continued, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed genuine rather than calculated. "Not everyone is willing to put in that kind of effort." The elevator arrived, and they rode down together in comfortable silence. As the doors opened to the lobby, Marcus held them for her with old-fashioned courtesy that felt strange after so many years of being treated as an inconvenience. "Have a good evening, ma'am," he said with a slight nod. "You too," Sarah replied, surprised by the brief interaction that it contained more genuine respect than she typically received in an entire week from her colleagues. As she drove home through the city streets, Sarah found herself thinking about Marcus's simple comment about dedication. It was such a basic acknowledgement, the kind of thing that should have been routine in a professional environment. But in her world, hard work was either invisible or used as evidence that she was trying too hard, that she didn't understand how things really worked. Her apartment was a small one-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood, decorated with the kind of simple, practical furniture that suggested someone who spent most of her time elsewhere. The walls were mostly bare except for a few landscape photographs and a single-frame picture of her and Tommy in their dress uniform from several years earlier. Sarah paused in front of that photograph, studying the confident young woman who stared back at her. That woman had been unafraid to speak up, to take charge, to demand the respect she had earned through her actions. What happened to that fearlessness? She made herself a simple dinner and settled in front of her laptop to catch up on industry news and client research. Work had become her sanctuary, the one area where she could still feel competent and valuable, even if no one else seemed to notice. Her phone rang around 9:30, showing Tommy's number on the screen. "Hey," she answered, settling back on her couch. "Hey yourself. I've been thinking about our conversation today, and I want you to know that I'm worried about you." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "I told you I'm fine." "No, you're not. And that's okay, but lying to me about it isn't helping anyone." Tommy's voice carried the same direct honesty that had always been his trademark. "When's the last time you stood up for yourself? When's the last time you reminded someone who they're dealing with?" "It's different here, Tommy. The military was different. This is just office politics, and I'm not good at playing those games." "This isn't about games, Sarah. This is about people treating you like garbage, and you accepting it because you think that's what civilian life is supposed to be like." The accusation stung because it contained too much truth. Sarah had somehow convinced herself that the treatment she received at work was normal, that her inability to fit in was a personal failing rather than a reflection of her colleague's character. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Start fights with everyone? Make enemies out of people I have to work with every day?" I'm not talking about starting fights. I'm talking about remembering your own worth. The Sarah I know wouldn't let anyone treat her the way you've described. She'd find a way to earn their respect, or at least make it clear that disrespecting her came with consequences. After they hung up, Sarah sat in the darkness of her living room, thinking about her brother's words. He was right about one thing. She had changed, and not for the better. Somewhere along the way, she had allowed herself to become the victim of other people's cruelty, accepting their assessment of her worth instead of defining it for herself. The woman in that photograph on her wall wouldn't have recognized the person she had become. That woman had once been someone who commanded respect, not through office politics or social manipulation, but through competence, integrity, and the kind of quiet strength that spoke louder than any amount of flashy charisma. As she prepared for bed, Sarah caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror and noticed something she had been carefully hiding for 3 years. Just below her collar, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was the edge of a tattoo that told a story her colleagues could never imagine. Tomorrow would bring another day of subtle humiliations and professional invisibility. But for the first time in months, Sarah found herself wondering what would happen if she stopped trying so hard to blend in and started remembering who she really was underneath the cardigan and careful politeness. The story her colleagues thought they knew about her was nothing compared to the truth of who Sarah Mitchell had been before she arrived at Henderson Marketing Solutions. And perhaps it was time for that truth to finally surface, whether they were ready for it or not. The next morning arrived with the same dreaded routine, but something felt different in Sarah's chest as she walked through the lobby of Henderson Marketing Solutions. Tommy's words from the night before echoed in her mind like a challenge she wasn't sure she was ready to accept. The elevator was crowded with the usual suspects. Jessica Walsh holding court with her inner circle. James Morrison checking his phone with the self-importance of someone who believed his every text message was crucial to world peace, and several other colleagues who barely acknowledged Sarah's presence as she squeezed into the corner. So I told the client that if they wanted premium results, they needed to pay premium prices, Jessica was saying, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never questioned her own importance. Some people just don't understand that quality costs money. Sarah knew the account Jessica was referencing. It was actually one of Sarah's clients who had been transferred to Jessica after a reorganization 6 months earlier. The premium pricing strategy Jessica was taking credit for had been Sarah's recommendation, implemented successfully for 8 months before the transfer. But correcting the record would only invite more ridicule, so Sarah remained silent. As the elevator opened on the 7th floor, Marcus Rodriguez stepped aside to let the others exit first. His eyes met Sarah's briefly, and she was surprised to see what looked like recognition there, as if he had noticed something about the group dynamics during the short ride. "Ladies first," he said with old-school courtesy, gesturing for Sarah to exit before him. It was a small thing, but in an environment where Sarah was typically treated as furniture to be walked around, the simple acknowledgement of her presence felt almost revolutionary. At her desk, Sarah found herself thinking about the conversation with her brother while she reviewed her morning emails. One message in particular caught her attention, a note from Marcus Rodriguez's assistant requesting a meeting to discuss security protocols for her department's client files. As someone who handled sensitive advertising campaigns and client data, Sarah was apparently considered a key stakeholder in the building's security review. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same people who dismissed her professionally were about to learn that the security consultant specifically wanted to speak with her about protecting confidential information. It was a reminder that competence existed outside the narrow social hierarchies that ruled her daily existence. The morning progressed with its usual undercurrent of tension. During the 10 o'clock staff meeting, Sarah presented updates on 3 major accounts, each showing significant growth and client satisfaction improvements. Her presentation was thorough, professional, and backed by hard data that would have impressed any objective observer. "Thank you, Sarah," Mr. Henderson said when she finished, his tone suggesting polite disinterest. "Now, I want everyone to pay attention to what Jessica has planned for the Morrison campaign. This is the kind of creative thinking that sets us apart from our competitors." Sarah's heart sank as Jessica stood up to present an idea that was almost identical to a strategy Sarah had proposed for the Morrison account 3 months earlier. The concept had been rejected then as too risky and not aligned with our brand identity. Now, coming from Jessica, it was being praised as innovative and bold. As Jessica fielded questions and compliments from around the room, Sarah felt something shifting inside her chest. It wasn't anger exactly, though that was certainly part of it. It was more like a slow-burning awareness that her current situation was unsustainable and ultimately destructive to everything she had once believed about herself. After the meeting, Sarah returned to her desk to find a sticky note from Jessica. Thank for the inspiration on the Morrison campaign. Great minds think alike. Face blowing a kiss, the casual theft of her intellectual property, disguised as friendly collaboration, was delivered with the kind of emoji that felt deliberately infantilizing. Sarah stared at the note for a long moment, feeling the familiar urge to crumple it up and pretend it didn't matter. Instead, she carefully placed it in a folder where she had been quietly documenting similar incidents over the past year. She wasn't sure what she planned to do with the evidence, but something told her it might be useful someday. Around noon, Sarah received a call from Marcus Rodriguez's office confirming their meeting for 2 o'clock. The security review would take place in Conference Room C, the same room where she had been presenting her stolen ideas just that morning. When the time came, Sarah knocked on the conference room door and was surprised to find Marcus alone, surrounded by several manila folders and a laptop computer. She had expected a larger group, perhaps including someone from HR or upper management. "Ms. Mitchell, please come in," Marcus said, standing as she entered. "Thank you for making time for this. I know you have a demanding schedule." Again, Sarah was struck by the simple courtesy of being treated as if her time had value. She took a seat across from him, noting the way his posture and bearing suggested military background, though she couldn't immediately place which branch or specialty. "I've been reviewing the security protocols for different departments," Marcus began, "and I have to say your client data management practices are exemplary. Most people in your position don't take information security nearly as seriously as you do." Sarah felt a flush of pride at the unexpected compliment. "I've always believed that protecting client confidentiality is fundamental to building trust. If they can't rely on us to safeguard their information, why should they trust us with their business?" Marcus nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of thinking that prevents security breaches. Too many people treat data protection as an afterthought rather than a core responsibility. As they discussed various protocols and procedures, Sarah found herself relaxing in a way that felt foreign after 3 years of workplace interactions. Marcus asked thoughtful questions about her processes, listened carefully to her answers, and treated her expertise as genuinely valuable. "I noticed you use encrypted storage for all digital files," Marcus observed, reviewing his notes. "That's above and beyond what most companies require. What prompted you to implement that level of security?" The question touched on something Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to discuss. The truth was that her approach to information security came from her military background, where protecting classified data could mean the difference between life and death for people in the field. "I suppose I'm just naturally cautious," she said carefully. "Better to be over-prepared than to discover you're vulnerable after something goes wrong." Marcus studied her for a moment, and Sarah had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing more than she intended to reveal. His eyes held the kind of sharp intelligence she remembered from her military days, the ability to read between lines and pick up on details that others missed. "That's the voice of experience," he said finally. "Most people learn to be cautious through trial and error, but you seem to have developed these habits early in your career. Did you work in a high-security environment before coming here?" The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt her carefully constructed civilian persona beginning to crack. For 3 years, she had worked hard to bury any trace of her previous life, believing that her military experience would only make her more of an outsider in the corporate world. "I've always been detail-oriented," she said, deflecting the question without directly lying. Marcus nodded, but Sarah could tell he wasn't entirely convinced by her evasion. They continued their discussion for another 20 minutes, covering password protocols, file access procedures, and emergency response plans. Throughout the conversation, Sarah found herself speaking with more confidence than she typically displayed in professional settings. When the meeting concluded, Marcus walked her to the conference room door. "I have to say, Ms. Mitchell, it's refreshing to work with someone who takes security seriously without needing to be convinced of its importance. Most people see it as bureaucratic nonsense that gets in the way of their real work. Information is only valuable if you can control who has access to it," Sarah replied without thinking. "Once you lose that control, you've lost everything that matters." The statement came out with more authority than Sarah had intended, revealing a perspective shaped by experiences her colleagues couldn't imagine. Marcus's eyebrows lifted slightly, and she realized she had said too much. "That's a very sophisticated understanding of information warfare," he said quietly. "Most civilians don't think in those terms unless they've been trained to do so." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she realized her mistake. For 3 years, she had been so careful to hide any trace of her military background, convinced that it would only make her more of an outsider in an environment that already rejected her. "I read a lot about cybersecurity," she said weakly, knowing the explanation sounded inadequate. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Well, whatever your background, your department is in excellent hands from a security perspective. Thank you for your time, Ms. Mitchell." As Sarah returned to her desk, she felt unsettled by the conversation. Marcus's questions had been perfectly reasonable, but something about his manner suggested he suspected more than she had revealed. The careful civilian identity she had constructed felt suddenly fragile, as if one conversation with someone who knew what to look for could unravel years of careful concealment. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of routine tasks and familiar tensions. Jessica made another pointed comment about Sarah's antisocial tendencies during a team brainstorming session, and James Morrison suggested that Sarah might be more comfortable handling administrative tasks rather than client-facing projects. Each slight felt both painfully familiar and increasingly intolerable. Sarah found herself thinking about Marcus's respectful treatment during their meeting, the way he had listened to her expertise and valued her input. The contrast with her daily experience was so stark that it highlighted just how abnormal her situation had become. Around 5 o'clock, as her colleagues began their usual preparations for after-work socializing, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. "Thinking about what we talked about last night. You don't have to be someone else to fit in, Sarah. The right people will recognize your worth without you having to hide who you are." The message arrived at a moment when Sarah was watching Jessica charm a group of clients who had come in for a presentation, using ideas that Sarah recognized as her own work from previous campaigns. The theft was so casual and complete that Sarah wondered if Jessica even remembered that the concepts hadn't originated with her. What if they never recognize it? Sarah texted back, "What if trying to be myself just makes everything worse?" "Then, at least you'll know you were authentic," came Tommy's immediate response. "Better to fail as yourself than to succeed as someone else's version of who you should be." As the office emptied around her, Sarah remained at her desk, ostensibly finishing up client reports, but really trying to process the day's events. Marcus's meeting had stirred something in her that she thought she had successfully buried, a sense of competence and authority that felt dangerous in her current environment. Around 7 o'clock, she gathered her things and headed toward the elevator, expecting to find the building mostly empty. Instead, she encountered Marcus Rodriguez in the lobby, apparently finishing up his own workday. "Working late again, I see," he said with a slight smile. "You really are dedicated to your clients." "There's always something that needs attention," Sarah replied, falling into step beside him as they walked toward the parking garage. "That's true, but most people learn to set boundaries. In my experience, the ones who consistently go above and beyond usually have a strong sense of mission. They're not just doing a job, they're serving something larger than themselves." The observation was so accurate that Sarah felt exposed, as if Marcus had somehow seen through her careful facade to the core beliefs that still drove her work ethic. "I suppose I've always believed that if you're going to do something, you should do it right," she said carefully. "That's a good philosophy," Marcus agreed, though I imagine it can be frustrating in an environment where not everyone shares those standards. They reached the parking garage, and Sarah felt an unexpected reluctance to end the conversation. Talking with Marcus felt like breathing after years of holding her breath, a reminder of what professional respect was supposed to feel like. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said, stopping beside what Sarah assumed was his vehicle. "You seem like someone with strong leadership instincts, but I get the impression you're holding yourself back. Is that a conscious choice, or are you working in an environment that doesn't appreciate that kind of initiative?" The question was more direct than anything her colleagues had ever asked about her professional development. It also suggested that Marcus had observed more than she realized during his time in the building. "I've learned that it's sometimes better to focus on doing good work rather than trying to lead people who aren't interested in being led," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully. "That's one approach," Marcus nodded. "But leadership isn't always about convincing people to follow. Sometimes it's about demonstrating a standard that makes it impossible for others to ignore your competence. The best leaders I've known didn't ask for respect. They earned it through their actions. As Sarah drove home, she found herself replaying Marcus's words and wondering what he had seen in her that her colleagues missed entirely. His comments suggested someone who understood leadership dynamics in a way that went beyond typical corporate management training. More importantly, his observations had awakened something in Sarah that she had been trying to suppress for 3 years. The woman who had once commanded respect in high-stakes situations was still there, buried beneath layers of corporate politeness and self-doubt, but not entirely destroyed. That evening, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror and slowly peeled away the cardigan she used to hide her shoulders and arms. Beneath the conservative clothing was a body marked by experiences that her colleagues couldn't imagine, including the intricate tattoo that ran down her spine, a memorial to fallen comrades, and a reminder of missions that had tested every aspect of her courage and competence. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to really see the person in the mirror rather than the careful disguise she presented to the world. The woman looking back at her had earned respect in situations where failure meant people died, where leadership wasn't a matter of office politics, but of life and death decisions made under extreme pressure. That woman didn't deserve to be diminished by people whose greatest challenge was deciding where to go for lunch. As she prepared for bed, Sarah made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She was tired of being invisible, tired of watching her work be stolen and her expertise dismissed, tired of pretending that the treatment she received was normal or acceptable. She wasn't ready to reveal everything about her past, but she was ready to stop apologizing for her competence and dedication. If her colleagues wanted to continue their campaign of professional harassment, they were about to discover that their quiet target was far stronger than they had ever imagined. The next day would bring new challenges and familiar humiliations, but it would also bring an opportunity for Sarah to remember who she was before she had started trying to be someone else. The question was whether she had the courage to let that person finally emerge from the shadows where she had been hiding for far too long. Wednesday morning brought an unexpected development that would change everything. Sarah arrived at work to find an email from Mr. Henderson announcing the annual company retreat, a 3-day event at a mountain resort designed to build team cohesion and strategic alignment. What caught her attention, however, was the mention of Marcus Rodriguez as a special consultant who would be conducting leadership exercises and team-building activities. The retreat was scheduled for the following week, and attendance was mandatory for all department heads and senior staff. Sarah qualified as senior staff due to her client portfolio, though she had never been treated as such by her colleagues. As she read through the retreat agenda, Sarah felt a mixture of dread and anticipation. 3 days confined with her colleagues in a remote location sounded like a nightmare, but the presence of Marcus Rodriguez suggested that the usual social dynamics might not hold their typical power. "Oh, this is going to be interesting," Jessica Walsh announced loudly, reading the same email at her desk. "A mountain retreat with team-building exercises. I wonder if Sarah will actually participate this time, or if she'll find some excuse to hide in her room." The comment was delivered with Jessica's trademark combination of false concern and genuine malice, designed to sound supportive while actually highlighting Sarah's social isolation. "Maybe the fresh mountain air will help her come out of her shell," James Morrison added from across the room. "Though some people are just naturally introverted, I suppose." Sarah felt the familiar burn of humiliation, but underneath it was something new, a growing impatience with the constant stream of subtle insults disguised as friendly observations. She was tired of being discussed as if she weren't present, tired of having her personality analyzed, and found wanting by people whose opinions should matter. "I'm sure it will be an educational experience for everyone," Sarah said quietly, not looking up from her computer screen. The response surprised her colleagues, who were accustomed to silence or nervous deflection when they made their pointed comments. Jessica's eyebrows lifted slightly, as if she detected something different in Sarah's tone. "Absolutely," Jessica replied, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. "It'll be a great opportunity for everyone to show their true colors." The rest of the morning passed with an undercurrent of tension that felt different from usual. Sarah found herself paying closer attention to the casual cruelties that had become background noise in her daily life. Jessica's habit of accidentally scheduling meetings during Sarah's lunch break. James Morrison's tendency to interrupt her during presentations to ask questions that undermined her credibility. The way conversations stopped when she approached groups of colleagues, as if her presence automatically killed whatever interesting topic they had been discussing. Each incident felt sharper now, harder to dismiss as mere workplace friction. Sarah was beginning to recognize that what she had been experiencing wasn't normal office politics, but a sustained campaign of professional harassment designed to isolate and diminish her. Around 11 o'clock, Marcus Rodriguez appeared at Sarah's desk, clipboard in hand, and that same air of quiet competence she had noticed during their security meeting. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm conducting brief interviews with all senior staff about the upcoming retreat," he said. "Do you have a few minutes to discuss your expectations and any concerns you might have?" Sarah glanced around the office, noting how conversations had subtly shifted as her colleagues strained to overhear. Being singled out for a personal consultation with the retreat facilitator was an unusual development that clearly intrigued the people who typically ignored her. "Of course," Sarah replied, standing and following Marcus to an empty conference room. Once the door was closed, Marcus's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming more direct and focused. "I'll be honest with you, Ms. Mitchell. I've been observing workplace dynamics here for the past few weeks, and I have some concerns about team cohesion that go beyond typical corporate politics." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. "What kind of concerns?" "The kind that suggests some employees may be experiencing systematic exclusion or harassment from their colleagues. The kind that can create liability issues for companies that don't address them properly." The statement hung between them like a challenge. Sarah realized that Marcus had seen what she had been enduring, had recognized it for what it was rather than dismissing it as personality conflicts or social awkwardness. "I'm not sure what you mean," Sarah said carefully, falling back on the defensive neutrality she had perfected over 3 years of abuse. "Ms. Mitchell, I've led teams in some of the most challenging environments you can imagine. I know what healthy workplace dynamics look like, and I know what toxic behavior looks like. What I've observed here isn't normal, and it's not something you should have to tolerate." Marcus's directness was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in years, someone was acknowledging that her experience wasn't the result of her own social failures, but of other people's deliberate cruelty. "Even if that's true," Sarah said quietly, "what am I supposed to do about it? I need this job, and making waves will only make things worse." "Making waves?" Marcus repeated, his tone suggesting mild surprise. "You think standing up for yourself constitutes making waves?" The question touched on something Sarah hadn't realized about her own thinking. Somewhere along the way, she had internalized the idea that any response to mistreatment would be seen as unprofessional or disruptive, that the problem was her inability to tolerate behavior that others seemed to find acceptable. "I've tried to fit in," Sarah said, hearing the defeat in her own voice. "I've tried to be professional, to focus on my work, to not give anyone a reason to complain about me. But nothing I do seems to matter." "That's because you're approaching this from the wrong angle," Marcus said firmly. "You're trying to earn acceptance from people who have already decided they don't respect you. But respect isn't something you can win through accommodation. It's something you command through your actions and your refusal to accept less than you deserve." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they reminded her of the person she used to be. There had been a time when she wouldn't have tolerated this kind of treatment for 5 minutes, let alone 3 years. "The retreat is going to be an interesting environment," Marcus continued. "Away from familiar surroundings, participating in exercises designed to reveal character under pressure. Some people might discover that their usual tactics don't work in that setting." Sarah studied his face, trying to understand what he was really saying. "Are you suggesting that things might be different there?" "I'm suggesting that leadership emerges in challenging environments, and that competence becomes harder to ignore when people are forced to work together toward common goals. The retreat exercises I've designed tend to strip away social pretenses and reveal who people really are when it matters." As Sarah returned to her desk, she felt something shifting inside her chest again. Marcus's observations had validated what she had been experiencing while also suggesting that change was possible. The retreat suddenly seemed less like an ordeal to be endured and more like an opportunity for truth to finally surface. The rest of the week passed in a blur of preparation and growing tension. Jessica made several pointed comments about hoping everyone would step up their game during the retreat, while James Morrison suggested that some people might find the leadership exercises challenging given their natural tendencies toward following rather than leading. Each comment felt like a verbal slap, but Sarah found herself responding differently than usual. Instead of shrinking back or deflecting, she met their eyes steadily and said nothing, letting their words hang in the air without the usual nervous laughter or self-deprecating responses they had come to expect. The change was subtle, but noticeable. Jessica's comments began to sound more shrill, as if Sarah's lack of visible reaction was somehow unsatisfying. James Morrison started adding explanatory follow-ups to his insults, as if he needed to clarify his meaning when Sarah didn't immediately crumble. Friday afternoon brought a department meeting to finalize retreat preparations. As the team gathered in the conference room, Mr. Henderson outlined the schedule and expectations for the 3-day event. This is an opportunity for all of us to strengthen our working relationships and discover new ways to collaborate effectively, he said, reading from notes that sounded like corporate boilerplate. Mr. Rodriguez has designed activities that will challenge us to work together in new ways and demonstrate our individual strengths. Sarah noticed the way her colleagues glanced at each other when Henderson mentioned individual strengths, as if they were already planning how to manipulate the exercises to their advantage. "Are there any questions about the retreat agenda?" Henderson asked. Jessica raised her hand with theatrical enthusiasm. "I'm wondering if the leadership exercises will be designed for people with different personality types. Some people are natural leaders, while others are more comfortable in supporting roles. It would be a shame if anyone felt pressured to act outside their comfort zone." The question was clearly directed at Sarah, another attempt to preemptively diminish her participation in activities that might reveal her capabilities. "That's an excellent question," Henderson replied. "Mr. Rodriguez, could you address that?" Marcus stood up with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "The exercises are designed to reveal leadership potential that may not be obvious in traditional office environments. Sometimes the people who seem quiet or reserved in meetings demonstrate exceptional leadership when faced with real challenges." His eyes met Sarah's briefly, and she felt a jolt of recognition pass between them. "In my experience," Marcus continued, "the most effective leaders are often the ones who lead by example rather than by charisma. They're the people who stay calm under pressure, who make decisions based on competence rather than politics, and who earn respect through their actions rather than their ability to work a room." The description was so pointed that Sarah wondered if Marcus was deliberately challenging her colleagues' assumptions about leadership dynamics. Jessica's smile looked slightly strained as she responded. "Of course, competence is important, though communication skills and the ability to inspire others are also crucial for effective leadership." "Absolutely," Marcus agreed, though it's worth noting that inspiration often comes from watching someone perform under pressure rather than from listening to speeches in comfortable conference rooms. The retreat will provide opportunities for both approaches to leadership. As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt a mixture of anticipation and terror about the coming week. Marcus's comment suggested that the retreat might level the playing field in ways her colleagues weren't expecting, but she still wasn't sure she was ready to reveal the leadership capabilities she had been hiding for 3 years. That evening, Sarah received a call from Tommy that seemed to arrive at exactly the right moment. "How are you feeling about the retreat?" he asked, somehow knowing that she needed to talk about it. "Nervous," Sarah admitted, "but also ready for something to change. I can't keep living like this, Tommy. I can't keep pretending that the way they treat me is acceptable." "Good," Tommy said firmly. "It's about time you remembered that you're not the problem in this situation. You're dealing with people who mistake kindness for weakness, and that's their failure, not yours. But what if I try to stand up for myself, and it backfires? What if showing them who I really am just makes everything worse?" "Sarah, listen to me. The person you really are is someone who has earned respect in situations that would break most of these people. You've led teams through life and death scenarios. You've made decisions under pressure that saved lives. You think a bunch of corporate bullies are going to be able to handle you when you stop playing their game?" As Sarah hung up the phone, she felt something crystallizing in her chest. The retreat was going to happen whether she was ready or not. She could continue to hide behind her careful civilian persona, accepting whatever scraps of dignity her colleagues decided to throw her way, or she could finally stop apologizing for her competence. The weekend passed slowly, filled with nervous energy and strange dreams about situations where she had to choose between safety and authenticity. By Sunday evening, Sarah had made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She was done hiding, done apologizing, done allowing people who had never faced real challenges to define her worth based on their own narrow understanding of strength and leadership. The retreat would either vindicate 3 years of careful self-suppression, or would finally reveal who Sarah Mitchell really was beneath the cardigan and careful politeness. Either way, she was tired of living as a diminished version of herself just to make other people comfortable. Monday morning couldn't come fast enough. The mountain resort appeared through the bus windows like something from a corporate brochure. Rustic log buildings nestled against pine-covered slopes, with a main lodge that promised authentic wilderness experiences for urban professionals seeking temporary adventure. Sarah watched her colleagues exclaim over the scenery with the enthusiasm of people who had never spent real time in truly remote environments. "This is amazing," Jessica gushed, taking selfies through the bus window. "I feel like I'm in a movie set. So rustic and authentic." Sarah bit back a smile at the description of authentic wilderness that included heated cabins, a full-service spa, and wireless internet throughout the grounds. But she kept her observations to herself, not wanting to spoil anyone's excitement with inconvenient reality. The group was assigned to cabins based on a room assignment list that had clearly been designed to either foster collaboration or create maximum drama. Sarah found herself sharing a cabin with Jessica and 2 other women from the marketing department, an arrangement that seemed deliberately designed to intensify the social dynamics that made her daily life difficult. As they unpacked their bags, Jessica launched into an enthusiastic monologue about her expectations for the retreat. "I'm really hoping these leadership exercises will give me a chance to showcase my natural management abilities. I've always been good at bringing out the best in people and creating team synergy." Sarah listened to the self-congratulatory speech while hanging her conservative business casual clothes in the small closet. She had packed carefully, choosing outfits that would maintain her professional image while allowing for outdoor activities. What she hadn't packed was the usual cardigan that covered her shoulders and arms, a decision that felt both deliberate and terrifying. The first activity was scheduled for after lunch, a getting-to-know-you session in the main lodge where Marcus would outline the retreat objectives and introduce the team-building exercises. As the group gathered in a circle of comfortable chairs arranged around a massive stone fireplace, Sarah noticed how naturally her colleagues fell into their familiar social hierarchies. Jessica positioned herself prominently in the center of the group, flanked by her usual admirers. James Morrison claimed a spot where he could easily dominate conversations, while several other employees arranged themselves to maximize their visibility to Mr. Henderson. Sarah took a seat slightly outside the main cluster, not from shyness this time, but from a strategic desire to observe the group dynamics from a less central position. Marcus entered the lodge wearing outdoor gear that looked genuinely used rather than freshly purchased for the occasion. His presence immediately shifted the energy in the room, commanding attention without apparent effort. "Welcome to what I hope will be an educational and transformative 3 days," he began, his voice carrying easily through the space. "Over the next 72 hours, we're going to engage in exercises designed to reveal leadership potential, test problem-solving abilities, and explore how teams function under various types of pressure." He paused to let his words sink in before continuing. "Some of you may discover capabilities you didn't know you possessed. Others may find that skills that work well in conference rooms don't translate effectively to other environments. The goal isn't to embarrass anyone, but to create situations where authentic leadership can emerge." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as Marcus's eyes swept the group, pausing briefly on her before moving on. His emphasis on authentic leadership felt like a direct challenge to the performance-based management style that dominated her workplace. "Our first exercise is called crisis management," Marcus announced. "You'll be divided into teams of 4 and presented with a scenario that requires immediate decision-making under time pressure. Each team will have 30 minutes to develop a response plan, and then you'll present your solutions to the group for evaluation." The scenario he outlined involved a product recall crisis that threatened both public safety and company reputation. Teams would need to coordinate media response, customer communication, logistics management, and legal compliance while operating with incomplete information and external pressure. Sarah found herself assigned to a team with Jessica, James Morrison, and Carol Jean from the finance department. As they gathered around a table covered with relevant documents and background information, Jessica immediately assumed the role of team leader. "Okay, everyone, let's approach this systematically," Jessica began, her voice carrying the forced enthusiasm of someone performing leadership rather than actually leading. "I think we should start by identifying our key stakeholders and then develop messaging strategies for each group." It was exactly the kind of process-heavy approach that sounded impressive, but failed to address the immediate crisis at hand. Sarah studied the scenario materials while Jessica outlined her communication strategy, noting several critical elements that were being overlooked in favor of public relations concerns. "What about the actual product recall logistics?" Sarah asked quietly. "We need to identify which distribution centers are affected and coordinate with manufacturing to determine the scope of contaminated inventory." Jessica paused mid-sentence, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "That's a good point, Sarah, but I think we need to focus on the big-picture strategy first before we get bogged down in operational details." "The operational details are what determine whether we can actually execute the strategy," Sarah replied, her voice remaining calm, but gaining confidence. "If we don't know how many units need to be recalled or where they're located, any communication plan we develop will be based on incomplete information." James Morrison jumped in to support Jessica. "Sarah's right that logistics matter, but Jessica is also right about needing an overarching approach. Maybe we should divide responsibilities so everyone can focus on their strengths." The suggestion sounded diplomatic, but was clearly designed to sideline Sarah while preserving Jessica's authority. Sarah felt the familiar pattern of being marginalized beginning to unfold, but this time something inside her resisted the relegation to a supporting role. "Actually," Sarah said, reaching for the scenario documents, "I think we're approaching this backwards. In a real crisis, you don't develop communication strategies before you understand the scope and timeline of the operational response. Let me walk through what I'm seeing here." Before anyone could object, Sarah began laying out the key elements of the crisis in logical order, identifying the critical decision points that would determine both the company's legal exposure and its ability to protect public safety. Her analysis was systematic, thorough, and delivered with a quiet authority that seemed to emerge naturally from her understanding of crisis management principles. "The contamination appears to have originated in the Denver manufacturing facility approximately 3 weeks ago," Sarah explained, pointing to relevant details in the documentation. "Based on the distribution timeline, affected products would have reached retail locations in 7 states. Our first priority needs to be coordinating with those retail partners to remove product from shelves and prevent additional sales." Jessica's expression grew increasingly strained as Sarah continued her analysis, clearly frustrated by the shift in group dynamics. "That's very thorough, Sarah, but we also need to consider the reputational impact of how we handle this situation. Customer trust is everything in our industry." "Absolutely," Sarah agreed, "which is why our communication needs to be based on accurate information about what we're actually doing to address the problem. Customers respond better to competence than to spin." The exchange highlighted a fundamental difference in approaches: Jessica's focus on managing perceptions versus Sarah's emphasis on managing reality. Carol Jean, who had been quietly taking notes, seemed increasingly drawn to Sarah's systematic approach. "Sarah's framework makes sense to me," Carol said finally. "If we start with the operational requirements, we can build the communication strategy around actual capabilities and timelines rather than aspirational messaging." James Morrison looked uncomfortable with the shifting team dynamics. "I think we're overthinking this. The exercise is probably designed to test our creativity and communication skills, not our ability to memorize logistics procedures. Or it's designed to test our ability to manage an actual crisis," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a note of steel that surprised even her. "In which case, creative messaging without operational competence is just expensive failure." The comment landed with unexpected force, highlighting the gap between performance-focused leadership and results-oriented problem-solving. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt like she was operating in an environment where competence mattered more than charisma. As the 30-minute preparation time drew to a close, their team had developed a comprehensive response plan that prioritized public safety, minimized legal exposure, and provided clear communication based on verified information rather than aspirational promises. Sarah had effectively taken the lead role through the force of her systematic thinking and crisis management expertise, though she had been careful to frame her contributions as team collaborative efforts. When Marcus called time, each team gathered to present their solutions to the full group. The first two teams delivered presentations that emphasized marketing messaging and public relations strategy, focusing heavily on protecting brand reputation and maintaining customer confidence. When Jessica stood up to present their team solution, she began with her usual confident demeanor, outlining the communication strategy she had initially proposed. But as she moved into the operational components of their plan, she found herself relying more on Sarah's analysis and framework. Our team recognized that effective crisis management requires a systematic approach to operational challenges, Jessica said, consulting notes that were clearly based on Sarah's work. We prioritized immediate safety concerns while developing communication strategies based on verified information rather than preliminary assessments. Marcus listened carefully to each presentation, asking pointed questions that revealed the depth of thinking behind each team's approach. When he questioned their team about implementation timelines and logistics coordination, Jessica turned to Sarah for support. Sarah developed our operational framework, Jessica said, her tone suggesting reluctant acknowledgement rather than generous credit. Maybe she can walk through some of the specifics. Sarah stood up, feeling the familiar nervousness of public speaking, but also sensing something different in the room's energy. Marcus was listening with the focused attention of someone who understood the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical expertise. The key insight is that crisis management is fundamentally about sequence and timing, Sarah began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. You can't develop effective communication until you understand what you're actually capable of implementing within specific timeframes. As she outlined their operational approach, Sarah found herself drawing on experiences that went far beyond anything her colleagues had encountered. Her understanding of logistics coordination, information management, and decision-making under pressure came from environments where mistakes had life-or-death consequences rather than quarterly profit implications. Effective leadership in crisis situations means making decisions with incomplete information while maintaining clear priorities, Sarah continued, her voice carrying unconscious authority. You have to distinguish between what's urgent and what's merely important, and you have to be prepared to adjust your approach as new information becomes available. The room had grown quiet, with her colleagues paying closer attention than they typically did to anything Sarah said. Marcus was nodding approvingly, his expression suggesting recognition of something that went beyond corporate training exercises. That's an excellent analysis, Marcus said when Sarah finished. Your approach demonstrates understanding of crisis management principles that typically take years of real-world experience to develop. The comment hung in the air like a question, and Sarah felt the familiar tension of revealing more than she had intended. But for the first time in years, she didn't immediately retreat into apologetic deflection. Some lessons stay with you longer than others, she said simply, meeting Marcus's eyes with steady confidence. After the presentations concluded, Marcus announced that the evening would include individual consultations where he would provide feedback on leadership styles observed during the exercise. Sarah wasn't sure whether to be excited or terrified by the prospect of one-on-one discussion with someone who clearly saw more than she had been prepared to reveal. As the group dispersed for dinner, Jessica caught up with Sarah in the hallway outside the lodge. That was really impressive back there, Jessica said, her tone carefully neutral. I had no idea you had that kind of background in crisis management. Thank you, Sarah replied, not offering the additional explanation that Jessica was clearly fishing for. I mean, it's interesting how different people respond to pressure situations, Jessica continued, probing for information. Some people just seem to have natural instincts for that kind of thing. Sarah studied Jessica's face, recognizing the mixture of curiosity and calculation that suggested her colleague was trying to understand what had just happened so she could figure out how to counter it. I suppose everyone brings different experiences to these exercises, Sarah said, noncommittally. As they entered the dining room, Sarah noticed that the seating arrangement had subtly shifted from the usual patterns. Several colleagues who typically ignored her were now positioning themselves where they could continue conversations about the crisis management exercise. For the first time in years, Sarah found herself at the center of professional discussions rather than relegated to the periphery. The change felt both validating and dangerous. After 3 years of careful invisibility, Being noticed for her competence rather than her social awkwardness was intoxicating. But it also meant that she could no longer hide behind the safety of being overlooked and underestimated. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and more revealing exercises, but tonight, Sarah allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in years: professional pride in her own capabilities and the growing awareness that she might be stronger than anyone in that room had ever imagined. The second day of the retreat dawned crisp and clear, with mountain air that carried the promise of revelations Sarah wasn't sure she was ready for. As she dressed in hiking clothes for the day's outdoor exercises, she made a decision that had been building in her chest since Marcus's crisis management exercise. Today, she would leave the cardigan in the cabin. The simple act of choosing a sleeveless athletic top felt both liberating and terrifying. For 3 years, she had carefully concealed the tattoos that marked her arms and shoulders, knowing that they told a story her colleagues weren't prepared to understand. But hiding had become exhausting, and yesterday's taste of professional respect had awakened something in her that refused to be pushed back into the shadows. When she joined the group for breakfast, the change in her appearance was subtle but noticeable. Without her usual conservative covering, Sarah looked somehow more defined, more present, though none of her colleagues could quite identify what was different about her. Marcus outlined the day's activities over coffee and pastries that felt too civilized for what was about to unfold. The morning would include a series of physical team challenges designed to test problem-solving under stress, followed by individual leadership assessments that would push each participant outside their comfort zone. Today we move beyond theoretical scenarios into experiential learning, Marcus announced, his tone carrying a note of anticipation that suggested he was looking forward to what the day would reveal. You'll be working in different team configurations, facing challenges that require both physical coordination and strategic thinking. He paused to study the group, his eyes lingering briefly on Sarah's uncovered arms before continuing. Some of you may discover that your colleagues have capabilities that weren't apparent in yesterday's exercises. Others may find that their own skill sets are more versatile than they realized. The first challenge took place in a wooded area behind the lodge, where Marcus had set up an obstacle course that looked deceptively simple until he explained the rules. Teams would need to navigate the course while carrying equipment and coordinating movements, but individual team members would be randomly selected to lead different segments of the challenge. Sarah found herself partnered with a group that included James Morrison, Carol Zhang, and David Parr from the communications department. As they studied the course layout, James immediately began developing a strategy based on speed and efficiency. If we move fast enough, we can probably finish this before some of the other teams even figure out what they're doing, James said confidently. Sarah, you can handle the equipment coordination while the rest of us focus on the physical elements. It was the same pattern of delegation that had defined Sarah's workplace experience. Assign her the background tasks while others handled the visible leadership roles. But this time, Sarah found herself resistant to the familiar marginalization. Actually, she said quietly, I think we should focus on technique rather than speed. This course is designed to test coordination and problem-solving, not athletic ability. James looked surprised by her response. I appreciate the input, Sarah, but I think we need to be realistic about everyone's strengths. Some people are just better suited for certain types of challenges. The dismissal was delivered with the same patronizing tone James used in office meetings, but in the outdoor environment it sounded somehow smaller, less authoritative. Sarah felt something shifting inside her chest as she recognized that his workplace dominance was largely a product of environment rather than genuine leadership ability. Have you ever done anything like this before? Sarah asked, her voice remaining calm, but gaining an edge that her colleagues hadn't heard before. I was on my college track team, James replied defensively. I understand the importance of speed and efficiency in competitive situations. This isn't a track meet, Sarah said, studying the course with eyes that were seeing things her teammates missed. It's a tactical exercise designed to test coordination under pressure. Speed without technique just creates chaos. Before James could respond, Marcus called the teams to their starting positions. As they approached the first obstacle, a rope traverse that required team members to cross a 20-foot gap while maintaining physical connection, Sarah felt muscle memory awakening from years of dormancy. Okay, everyone, here's how we're going to approach this, James began, taking charge with his usual confidence. But As he outlined a strategy, Sarah could see several fundamental flaws that would likely result in team members falling or becoming separated. "James," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying unconscious authority, "if we anchor the rope at that angle, the third person across won't have enough leverage to maintain stability. We need to adjust the attachment point and use a different crossing sequence." The group paused, recognizing something different in Sarah's tone. This wasn't a tentative suggestion or polite input. It was tactical analysis delivered with quiet confidence that suggested real expertise. "How do you know that?" Carol asked, studying Sarah with new curiosity. Sarah felt the familiar moment of choice: deflect and retreat, or commit to honesty about capabilities she had been hiding for 3 years. The question hung in the morning air as her teammates waited for an answer that would determine how the rest of the exercise unfolded. "I've done this kind of thing before," Sarah said finally, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. Before anyone could ask follow-up questions, Marcus signaled the start of the exercise. Sarah's tactical analysis proved accurate as other teams struggled with the rope traverse, while her group moved across with methodical efficiency. James's initial resistance to her suggestions melted away as it became clear that Sarah's approach was not only working, but giving them a significant advantage. As they progressed through subsequent obstacles, Sarah found herself naturally assuming leadership responsibilities that her teammates seemed increasingly willing to accept. Her understanding of coordination techniques, risk assessment, and team communication was clearly superior to anything her colleagues possessed, though none of them could identify the source of her expertise. "You're really good at this," David Parr commented as they navigated a balance beam that required precise timing and trust between team members. "Where did you learn these techniques?" "Different places," Sarah replied, helping David maintain his balance while coordinating with the team members behind them. "You pick things up over time." The evasive answer only increased her teammates' curiosity, but there was no time for extended conversation as they moved toward the final obstacle, a wall climb that required team members to assist each other in reaching the top while working under time pressure. As Sarah studied the wall, calculating angles and anchor points with automatic precision, she became aware that Marcus was watching their team with particular interest. His expression suggested he was seeing something that confirmed suspicions he had been developing since the previous day's crisis management exercise. "All right, everyone," Sarah said, taking charge with natural authority that surprised her teammates. "Carol, you're our lightest climber, so you'll go up first to secure the rope. David, you, and I will create a human ladder for the initial boost. James, you'll coordinate from the ground, and then follow once we have the system established." The strategy was efficient, safe, and clearly based on experience with similar challenges. As they executed the plan, Sarah's movements displayed a level of physical competence and tactical thinking that went far beyond anything her colleagues associated with their quiet, reserved coworker. When Carol reached the top and secured the safety line, she called down with excitement, "Sarah, this is amazing. Where did you learn to do this stuff?" Before Sarah could respond, a commotion from one of the other teams drew everyone's attention. Jessica's group was struggling with the wall climb, and one of their team members had fallen, landing hard on the ground with what appeared to be a twisted ankle. Marcus immediately moved to assess the injury while calling for first aid supplies, but Sarah was already in motion, her response automatic and precise. She reached the injured person, Lisa Chun from accounting, before anyone else, and began a systematic evaluation that clearly demonstrated medical training. "Lisa, can you tell me where the pain is most severe?" Sarah asked, her voice calm and authoritative as she carefully examined the ankle. "Can you put any weight on it, or does movement increase the pain?" Her assessment was thorough and professional, checking for signs of serious injury while providing reassurance that kept Lisa calm. Within minutes, Sarah had determined that the injury was likely a minor sprain rather than a fracture, though she recommended keeping weight off the ankle until it could be properly evaluated. "You have medical training," Marcus observed, appearing beside her with a first aid kit that Sarah was already reaching for with practiced familiarity. "Some," Sarah replied, applying an ice pack and elevation with movements that spoke of extensive experience in field medicine. "Enough to handle basic injuries." As she worked, the entire retreat group had gathered around, watching Sarah manage the emergency with competence that seemed to emerge from nowhere. This was clearly not someone who had taken a weekend first aid course. Her response demonstrated the kind of medical training typically associated with military or emergency services backgrounds. "Where did you serve?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice pitched so that only Sarah could hear. The question hit her like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because it forced her to confront the truth she had been hiding for 3 years. Marcus had recognized what her civilian colleagues couldn't: the bearing, the tactical thinking, the medical training, and the leadership instincts that only came from military service in demanding circumstances. Sarah finished securing the ice pack before meeting Marcus's eyes. In that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. She was done hiding. "Afghanistan," she said simply. 3 tours. Combat medic attached to special operations units. The words hung in the mountain air, like a revelation that recontextualized everything her colleagues thought they knew about her. Sarah Mitchell, the quiet woman they had been dismissing and belittling for 3 years, was a combat veteran who had served multiple deployments in one of the most challenging theaters of military operations. James Morrison was the first to break the stunned silence. "You're a veteran? Why didn't you ever mention that?" "Because people's reactions tend to be complicated," Sarah replied, standing up from where she had been treating Lisa's injury. "And because I wanted to be judged on my civilian capabilities, not my military background." Jessica appeared at the edge of the group, her expression a mixture of shock and calculation as she processed this new information. "So all those leadership exercises yesterday and this morning's course, you've actually done things like this before?" "Similar things," Sarah confirmed, though usually with higher stakes and less comfortable accommodations. Marcus stepped forward, his expression carrying a respect that had been building throughout the retreat. "Ms. Mitchell, would you be willing to share some of your background with the group? I think there's a lot we could learn from your experiences." Sarah looked around at her colleagues, seeing confusion, curiosity, and something that might have been the beginning of respect in their faces. For 3 years, these people had treated her as someone who lacked the competence and leadership ability to succeed in their corporate environment. Now they were discovering that she had been operating at a level of responsibility and pressure that few of them could imagine. "I enlisted after college," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was sharing. "Completed combat medic training and volunteered for assignment with special operations units. Spent 3 years deployed to Afghanistan, providing medical support for teams conducting high-risk missions in contested territory." The corporate retreat setting suddenly felt surreal as Sarah described experiences that belonged to a different world entirely. Her colleagues listened with growing amazement as she outlined responsibilities that included trauma medicine under fire, tactical planning for extraction operations, and leadership decisions that determined whether team members came home alive. "The leadership principles you learn in that environment are pretty transferable," Sarah continued, her voice carrying quiet authority that commanded absolute attention. "Clear communication, decisive action based on available information, taking responsibility for your team's well-being, and earning respect through competence rather than politics." James Morrison raised his hand tentatively. "So, when you were analyzing the crisis management scenario yesterday, I was drawing on experience with actual crisis management," Sarah confirmed. "When people's lives depend on your decisions, you learn to cut through bureaucracy and focus on what actually matters." Carol Zhang spoke up with obvious respect. "Sarah, why didn't you tell us any of this before? Your background is incredible." "Because I wanted to prove that I could succeed in civilian life based on my current capabilities, not my military record," Sarah replied. "And because I've learned that people often don't know how to respond when they discover someone has a military background that includes combat experience." The conversation continued for another hour, with her colleagues asking questions about military service and gradually understanding how Sarah's quiet competence was actually the result of training and experience that went far beyond anything they had encountered. The crisis management expertise, the tactical thinking, the calm leadership under pressure, all of it made sense in the context of someone who had been tested in situations where failure meant casualties. As the retreat concluded and they prepared to return to their regular office environment, Sarah felt fundamentally changed by the experience of finally being honest about her background. Her colleagues' treatment of her had shifted dramatically once they understood who they were actually dealing with, though she wasn't sure whether the change was based on genuine respect or simply intimidation. Marcus approached her as she was loading her luggage onto the return bus. "Ms. Mitchell, I want you to know that watching you this week has been impressive. You have leadership capabilities that your current environment isn't utilizing effectively." "Thank you," Sarah replied, though I'm not sure how this is going to translate back to our normal office dynamics. That remains to be seen, Marcus said with a slight smile. But I suspect your colleagues will have a hard time returning to their previous assumptions about you now that they know the truth. The bus ride back to the city was subdued, with conversations that felt different from the casual cruelty that had characterized Sarah's previous interactions with her coworkers. Jessica made several attempts to engage Sarah in friendly conversation, as if trying to reposition their relationship now that she understood she had been harassing someone with a military background. When they arrived at the office building, Sarah felt like she was returning to a familiar place that had somehow become foreign.